It was January 17th, 2003, one of the coldest nights Michigan had endured that winter. The air itself seemed to freeze in place, every breath crystallizing under the dim glow of scattered streetlights. The roads of the small town were quiet, hushed in the way only a Midwest winter night can be, as if even the wind knew to hold its breath. She was last seen leaving a friend's house shortly after 10:30 p.m., bundled against the biting cold, her boots crunching over fresh snow. The roads were slick, the sky moonless, and the town seemed deserted. She was young, with her whole life ahead of her, someone everyone in town recognized, but few knew would soon become the center of a nightmare. The night was marked not by noise but by silence, a silence so deep that the hum of a distant highway sounded like thunder. Her car was spotted later, abandoned by the side of a narrow road leading back toward her family's house. The driver's door hung slightly ajar, headlights still faintly glowed. It was as if time had stopped in the middle of a journey. Investigators would later describe the discovery as eerily staged. Inside, the heat still lingered, suggesting she had been there only minutes before. On the fresh snow outside, her footprints trailed away from the vehicle, one, two, then a dozen clear impressions before vanishing. They ended abruptly, mid-path, as if she had been lifted into the air. No scuffle, no drag marks, just silence and absence. For her mother, the first pang of worry came when midnight passed and her daughter's bed remained empty. She called her cell phone over and over, the ringtone echoing in an empty room. By morning, that worry had turned to panic, and by dawn the town itself had begun to stir. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Sheriff's deputies arrived just after sunrise. They examined the abandoned car with flashlights, their beams cutting across the frost. Nothing seemed broken, nothing screamed of violence, yet everything felt unnatural. People don't just walk away from a running car in sub-zero temperatures, one deputy later recalled. The unease in his voice reflected what the entire community would soon feel. Her last footprints in the snow became the first haunting clue of the case. Neighbors gathered near the road that morning, bundled in heavy coats, whispering as the police cordoned off the area. They watched as dogs were brought out, as deputies scanned the frozen fields, their breath visible in the frigid air. But nothing. The snow revealed nothing more. The town didn't yet know it, but this moment would mark the beginning of a 12-year nightmare. A night where an ordinary Michigan winter turned into the first chapter of a mystery that would consume detectives, shatter a family, and leave a community haunted. Her footprints stopped, and from that moment, so did time for this town. To understand the depth of this tragedy, you have to first understand her. She wasn't just another face on a missing poster. She was the heartbeat of a family, the promise of a future, and the pride of a quiet Michigan town. Her name carried warmth in every household. Teachers remembered her as the student who stayed behind to help clean chalkboards. Friends recalled how she lit up any room with her laugh. She wasn't extraordinary in the way celebrities are, but extraordinary in the way people should be, kind, dependable, full of dreams that stretched far beyond the borders of her small community. She talked often of college, of leaving town but always coming back, determined to make something of herself. At just 19, she stood at the fragile edge between adolescence and adulthood, old enough to carry responsibility, but young enough to believe in the unbroken goodness of the world. She never imagined danger could lurk so close. The town she called home was typical of rural Michigan, a blue-collar community, where factory whistles once dictated daily life and church bells marked the weekends. Rows of modest houses lined the streets, porches sagging under decades of winters. Neighbors waved at one another from driveways. Families gathered for Friday night football games and Sunday potlucks. It was the kind of place people described as safe, where locking doors felt unnecessary. Everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. There was a sense of timelessness in the town, a rhythm of familiarity. Children grew up, graduated, found jobs at the local mill, and raised families in the same houses they themselves were raised in. Generations were layered over one another, bound by trust and tradition. The idea of evil, real human evil, seemed far away, something that belonged to big cities or late-night television. And that was the illusion that shattered in 2003. Because beneath the surface, the town carried secrets. Not everyone who waved from their porch was as friendly as they seemed. Not every neighbor's smile told the truth. The very closeness that gave the community comfort would soon prove to be its weakness. When tragedy struck, suspicion would ricochet through those narrow streets like a storm, turning neighbor against neighbor and stripping away the sense of innocence the town had clung to for decades. Her disappearance would expose a chilling truth. Even the smallest town can harbor darkness. For now, though, in the days before she vanished, she was remembered as radiant, brimming with life. Photographs later plastered across newspapers showed her smiling in a bright scarf, standing in the snow with friends, eyes full of possibility. No one looking at that image could imagine the silence that would soon follow, or the years of unanswered questions. The town believed it was immune to tragedy. They believed the world beyond their borders might be dangerous, but not here, not in their streets, not to one of their own. They believed that until January 2003, and as the hours ticked by after her disappearance, that belief crumbled, because what had begun as a cold winter night was quickly becoming a nightmare that would consume them all. The night of January 17, 2003, began like any other. She spent the early evening with close friends, laughing, swapping stories, and lingering over the kind of small-town conversations that made time slip by unnoticed. To those who saw her, she seemed happy, untroubled, and very much herself. Nothing suggested the storm about to unfold. Her last known hours are painstakingly preserved in fragments, eyewitness accounts, phone records, and the kind of details that investigators would later obsess over. At around 8:45 p.m., she phoned her mother to say she'd be home later. It was a simple call, one of countless between parent and child, but it would become the last her mother would ever hear in her daughter's living voice. By 9:30 p.m., she was spotted at a gas station off the main road, buying a small snack and a bottle of water. The clerk remembered her distinctly, her smile, her polite thank you, the way she adjusted her scarf as she walked out into the cold. That image, frozen in the clerk's memory, would haunt him for years. Around 10:15 p.m., she left a friend's house on the edge of town. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and powdery, dusting the already frozen ground. She waved goodbye, climbed into her car, and drove off into the dark. Her friend recalled the taillights, glowing red against the black night, fading into the distance until they disappeared. It was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. When midnight struck, her mother grew restless. She paced the living room, the clocks ticking louder with every passing minute. Calls to her daughter's phone went unanswered. By 12:30 a.m., worry turned into fear. She checked the roads herself, driving slowly through the falling snow, headlights cutting across the white fields, but saw nothing. At 1 a.m., she dialed the sheriff's office. By dawn, deputies had located the car. It sat on the shoulder of a narrow county road, hazards faintly blinking, engine still warm. The driver's door was unlocked. Her purse and phone were inside. The radio hummed faintly in static. It was as though she had simply vanished mid-journey. The footprints in the snow told a story, up to a point. They led away from the vehicle, clean and deliberate, then ended abruptly just yards later. No stumble, no slide, no return path. It was as if she had stepped into thin air. For investigators, this was the first red flag that shattered the illusion of a simple accident or voluntary disappearance. People don't just vanish into nothing. Something had happened on that road, something sinister. By 3 a.m., police cordoned off the area. Searchlights swept the nearby fields, dogs pawed at frozen ground, and volunteers trudged through snowdrifts calling her name. But there was no trace, no movement in the night, except for the whisper of wind across empty fields, and then silence, the kind of silence that chills bone and soul alike. When dawn broke, the town awoke to the news. A young woman had disappeared without a sound, and her car was all she left behind. It was the first page of a mystery that would torment them for over a decade. The first 2 days after her disappearance were a blur of panic, urgency and confusion. For investigators, these early hours were critical. They knew the clock was against them. The colder the trail, the harder the truth would be to find. By sunrise on January 18th, sheriff's deputies had mobilized every resource they could muster. Search teams combed frozen fields, their boots crunching through drifts of snow as dogs strained at leashes. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting across the blank white canvas of farmland. Volunteers lined ditches, calling her name into the still air, their voices fading into the emptiness. The town had never seen anything like it. Rows of squad cars lined the rural road where her vehicle sat abandoned. Detectives crouched by the open door, brushing frost off the dashboard, cataloging every detail. The purse on the passenger seat, the faint warmth still trapped in the vents, the silence that seemed louder than any alarm, and yet no clear sign of struggle, no blood, no broken glass, just a car left behind, and a set of footprints that ended far too soon. The investigation turned quickly to the people closest to her. The ex-boyfriend was questioned first, dragged into the harsh light of suspicion. His alibi was checked, his story pulled apart, his face scrutinized for cracks. Then came her circle of friends. Each one asked the same burning question: what really happened that night? Did she leave with someone? Did she trust the wrong person? In a town this small, rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered that she had run away, desperate for a new life. Others suggested darker possibilities, that someone she knew had lured her from her car, someone trusted enough for her to step willingly into the freezing night. By the second evening, tension was mounting. Detectives pushed harder, canvassing door to door, knocking on every farmhouse and trailer, demanding to know if anyone had seen headlights on the lonely road, heard the crunch of snow under hurried steps, or noticed a stranger in town. Each answer was the same: nothing. But something was off. In her car, among her belongings, detectives found an object that didn't belong. A cigarette butt wedged into the snow near the tire, odd because she didn't smoke. To investigators, it was a faint glimmer of possibility, a clue that perhaps someone else had been there with her in those final moments. For the family, the hours blurred into torment. Her mother stood outside the command post, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if willing her daughter to appear. Every time a deputy approached, her heart raced, only to sink again at the shake of her head. The first 48 hours passed with no answers, only mounting dread. The search widened, the theories multiplied, and the town's fragile sense of safety began to crumble. And as the sun set on the second night, one chilling truth was clear: whatever had happened on that road was no accident. But the real mystery, the who and the why, remained hidden in the shadows. By the third day, the disappearance was no longer just a police matter. It had become the soul of the town's conversations, the shadow over its streets, the unspoken fear behind every locked door. Candlelight vigils sprung up almost instantly, outside the courthouse, in churchyards, even in the high school parking lot. Clusters of neighbors gathered with trembling hands, shielding flickering flames from the wind. They prayed, they wept, and they whispered, the sound of 100 voices singing hymns into the freezing night, carried like a plea into the darkness: bring her home. Flyers bearing her face were stapled to telephone poles, taped to diner windows, and handed out by shivering volunteers on street corners. Her photograph, bright-eyed, smiling, alive, stared back at the town with an almost unbearable weight. Each poster became both a beacon of hope and a painful reminder of what had been lost. But as the hours turned into days, hope began to blur with suspicion. In a town where everyone knew each other, rumors spread with brutal speed. Coffee shop counters buzzed with theories. Neighbors eyed one another differently. Some insisted she must have left willingly, perhaps running away with someone she trusted. Others whispered that the culprit had to be one of their own, someone hiding in plain sight. The churches rang with prayer, yet even inside those sacred walls, whispers persisted. Mothers clutched their children more tightly. Fathers checked the locks on doors that had never before needed locking. At night windows glowed longer than usual, curtains cracked open as watchful eyes scanned the streets. For the victim's family, the town's support was both comforting and agonizing. Strangers left casseroles on their porch, teenagers marched in candlelight walks, and pastors spoke her name from pulpits. But behind each gesture of solidarity lay the gnawing question: who among them knew more than they were saying? The rumor mill spared no one. The ex-boyfriend's name surfaced again and again. Friends were interrogated, not just by police, but by neighbors, co-workers, and strangers. Even her family, heartbroken and desperate, felt the sting of whispered doubts. In small towns, silence is rarely empty. It is filled with suspicion, and still the official investigation dragged with no clear answers. Each day without progress made the community's whispers louder, sharper, more dangerous. Theories transformed into stories, and stories became accepted truths in the minds of those desperate for resolution. One question lingered on every lip: what really happened that night? And if someone in their midst was responsible, why wasn't anyone talking? The vigil flames eventually burned out, but the tension did not. By the end of the first week, the town was fractured, torn between hope, grief, and fear of the unknown. And in that fracture, detectives knew somewhere lay the truth. When the case began to stall, most in the community slowly drifted back into their daily lives. But for the detectives assigned, the disappearance became more than a job. It became an obsession. At the center of it was the lead investigator, a veteran of the sheriff's department. He was the kind of man who had weathered decades of cases, who had seen tragedy and cruelty, but nothing that cut this deep. He could not shake the image of the abandoned car, its headlights dimming in the snow. He couldn't forget the footprints that ended too soon. His office transformed into a shrine to the missing young woman. Photographs of her smile lined the corkboard. Maps of the town, strung together with red twine, traced the road she traveled that night. Polaroids of tire tracks, evidence bags, and witness statements covered the walls. Coffee cups stacked on his desk like tombstones of sleepless nights. Each clue, each fragment, became a piece of a puzzle he could not stop trying to solve. Detectives worked shifts that bled into one another. They drove the same back roads at the same times of night, hoping to glimpse something overlooked. They replayed interviews, looking for the word, the pause, the nervous tick that might betray a lie. Every theory was tested, discarded, tested again. Was she abducted by a stranger passing through? Did someone she trusted betray her? Or had something unimaginable happened, something hidden in plain sight? One theory haunted them most: the possibility that she had known her abductor. There were no signs of a struggle, no desperate scramble across the snow, only footprints that stopped. Could she have stepped willingly into someone else's car? Could she have believed she was safe? The case files grew thicker by the day, but answers remained elusive. Forensic teams combed through fibers, fingerprints and footprints, but the evidence told them nothing concrete. Then at last a sliver of hope emerged. A small, almost invisible trace collected from the car, a partial DNA profile. It was faint, inconclusive, but it was something. The detectives clung to it like lifeline. They sent it to every available lab, begged for analysis, and pored over the results.
Yet science in 2003 had its limits. The profile couldn't give them a name, it couldn't identify a suspect. It was a whisper of truth they could not yet hear. Still, the lead detective refused to let go. He carried the case home with him, staring at photographs long after midnight. He drove by the victim's house, by the lonely road where her car was found, as if answers might surface if he looked long enough. This was no longer just another investigation, it was a haunting, and yet despite the endless hours, the sleepless nights, and the desperate pursuit of answers, the case remained unsolved. The partial DNA was hope, but not salvation. For the detective, the obsession deepened. For the family, the waiting grew unbearable. And for the town, the silence became deafening. But buried in that silence was a truth, one that had yet to be uncovered. As weeks turned into months, the search for answers became a labyrinth of false leads, each one raising hope only to collapse into disappointment. Detectives chased every tip, no matter how improbable, desperate for a breakthrough, but time and again they found themselves at dead ends.
The first major lead came from within the town itself. A local man with a troubled past was arrested after neighbors whispered that he had been acting strangely. For days, headlines proclaimed that the case was nearly solved. But under the harsh scrutiny of evidence, the story unraveled. No DNA match, no connection to her car, nothing but suspicion built on rumor. The man was quietly released, but the damage was done. The community's hunger for justice had painted a target on his back. Then came the psychics. Letters arrived at the sheriff's office, scrawled with eerie maps and predictions. Some claimed her body was buried in the woods. Others swore she was alive, held captive in a nearby town. Detectives, unwilling to dismiss anything outright, checked the tips. They walked frozen fields, dug shallow holes, even knocked on doors where the supposed visions pointed. But each lead ended the same way. Nowhere. Anonymous phone calls followed. Voices whispered details that seemed convincing, until they crumbled under scrutiny. One caller claimed to have seen her with a stranger at a truck stop. Another insisted she was in Chicago. Detectives pursued every story, driving hundreds of miles, questioning dozens of witnesses, only to return empty-handed. The family watched all of this unfold with growing despair. Each arrest, each supposed tip, brought a flicker of hope that was quickly extinguished. They began to feel as if they were trapped in a cruel cycle of promises and disappointments, as if the truth was always just out of reach. Her mother would later say, "Every time the phone rang, I prayed it was the answer, and every time it wasn't." Years passed this way. Suspects came and went. Names filled files, then were crossed out. The partial DNA remained in storage, taunting investigators, but too weak to speak the truth. Detectives retired. New ones took their place. The evidence boxes grew dusty, stacked in a corner of the sheriff's office like gravestones of lost time. But buried in those boxes, among the photographs and transcripts, was the one thing everyone missed. A clue so small it seemed insignificant at the time. A trace that science had not yet caught up to. No one realized it then, but the key to the entire mystery was already in their possession. It would take more than a decade for that truth to come alive, and in the meantime, the family, the detectives, and the town would endure the agony of not knowing. By the late 2000s, the case had slipped from headlines into the shadows. What began as front-page news, a daily obsession for the town and investigators alike, slowly faded into silence. Time, relentless and unforgiving, dulled the urgency, though never the pain. For her family, each passing year was marked not by seasons but by absences. Birthdays came and went without her laughter. Holidays were observed with one empty chair that no one dared to touch. Photographs of her grew older, while she remained frozen in time, forever 19. Her mother described it as living in a house where the clocks have stopped, but the days still drag on. The town, once alive with vigils and prayer circles, fell quiet. Missing posters weathered on telephone poles until they peeled away. Neighbors who had once gathered nightly in solidarity stopped mentioning her name at all. The silence was perhaps the cruelest wound of all, because silence felt like forgetting. Inside the sheriff's department, the case gathered dust. Evidence boxes were stacked on metal shelves, their labels fading. Detectives who had once poured every waking moment into the investigation retired, taking with them years of intimate knowledge of the case. Younger officers inherited the files, but with dozens of active cases competing for attention, the unsolved disappearance became just another folder in a sea of cold cases. The lead detective, who had once lived and breathed the mystery, eventually stepped back. His health was waning, and the years of obsession had taken their toll. He carried the weight of failure with him, haunted by the belief that the answer had always been close, but just out of reach. The community, too, adapted to the absence. Parents still warned their daughters about walking alone, but the urgency faded. Whispers turned into resigned shrugs. The tragedy became part of the town's history, spoken of less as an open wound and more as an unsolvable mystery, a story to caution, not a call to action. For her family, however, the waiting never ended. Each phone call could still bring news. Each knock on the door could still be the answer. They clung to the memory of her, to the belief that someday the truth would surface. Her mother, in interviews years later, said, "People think we moved on. We never did. You don't move on from not knowing." By 2015, more than a decade had passed. The investigation had stalled so completely that even the sheriff's office spoke of it in the past tense. Detectives had given up, the town had stopped talking, and even those who once swore to find answers had turned their focus elsewhere. But within the silence, the truth still waited. And the case, though frozen, was not dead. The year was 2018 when the silence finally cracked. By then, advances in forensic science had reshaped the landscape of cold case investigations. What once seemed impossible was now routine, and among those breakthroughs was a tool that would change everything: forensic genealogy. It began quietly. A new detective, assigned to review forgotten files, opened the boxes stacked in storage. Among them he found the partial DNA profile collected from her car years earlier, the trace that had haunted investigators for over a decade. At the time it had been useless, too incomplete for CODIS, too weak to identify. But science had caught up. Now those same fragments could be analyzed with powerful new technology. The detective sent the sample to a specialized lab. Weeks later the results came back. Not a direct hit, but something tantalizing: distant relatives, scattered across the country. It was a family tree waiting to be built. With genealogists working alongside law enforcement, the painstaking process began. They combed through public records, obituaries, marriage certificates, and social media profiles, slowly weaving together branches of a family line. What started as a puzzle with thousands of pieces narrowed, little by little, until all paths pointed to one man. He wasn't on anyone's radar. He wasn't the local troublemaker, the rumored stalker, or the drifter people once whispered about. He was a man who had lived quietly in the shadows of the community, blending in so well that no one suspected him. But the science didn't lie. His DNA was there. Detectives moved carefully. They surveilled him, watching his routines. They collected discarded items, coffee cups, cigarette butts, anything that could yield DNA. And when the lab confirmed the match, the silence of years shattered in an instant. The name of the suspect rippled through the department. For the older detectives, it was a gut punch. After decades of chasing false leads, of knocking on the wrong doors, the truth had been right there all along. The younger detectives, armed with the evidence of modern science, felt the weight of history pressing on them. This was the break no one thought would come. When the arrest warrant was signed, the family was notified first. They had lived with 13 years of unanswered questions, their lives paused in grief. Now a name, a face, an arrest. Her mother wept when the detective told her. "I always prayed for this day," she said. "I just didn't know if I'd live to see it." The community, too, was shaken awake. Headlines screamed that the case everyone thought unsolvable had been cracked wide open. Vigils were held again, candles lit for justice. The town that had once fallen silent now buzzed with shock, anger, and a cautious sense of relief. After more than a decade, the cold case was no longer cold. Science had spoken, the truth had emerged, and the long wait for justice was finally coming to an end. The arrest unfolded on an ordinary morning, in the quiet of a suburban neighborhood. Detectives surrounded the suspect's home at dawn, their breath visible in the cool air as they moved in silence. Neighbors peered through curtains, unaware that history was about to be made just across the street. When the suspect stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, he was met with the command of armed officers. For a moment he froze, confusion flashing across his face. Then came the realization, the weight of years bearing down in an instant. He was handcuffed on his own front lawn, the ordinary facade of his life shattering in front of everyone who thought they knew him. At the sheriff's office, the interrogation room was stark. The man sat slumped in a metal chair, his hands trembling against the cuffs. Detectives laid out the evidence, the DNA, the genealogy, the surveillance. Piece by piece, they constructed the story he had spent years trying to bury. At first he denied everything. He shook his head, muttered that it was a mistake, but the science was undeniable, and the detectives pressed harder. They showed him photographs of her, the girl who had vanished all those years ago. They spoke of her family, her mother still waiting for answers. The silence stretched. His eyes darted to the floor, and then almost imperceptibly, his shoulders sagged. The facade cracked. What followed was not a single admission, but a flood. He confessed. The words spilled out, disjointed, halting but unmistakable. He described how he had seen her that night, how he had followed her, how a moment of dark impulse became a crime that would haunt an entire community. He admitted to abducting her, taking her by force, and ending her life. He told them where it had happened, how he had tried to cover his tracks, how he thought he had buried the secret forever. For the detectives in the room, the confession was both vindication and devastation. They had fought for years against the silence, the dead ends, the disbelief. Now they had the truth, but hearing it spoken aloud brought no relief, only the horror of knowing exactly what had been done. When news of the arrest and confession broke, the town erupted. Shock rippled through the community. Some wept, others raged. How could it have been someone living among them, someone they had passed in the grocery store, someone they had trusted? For the family, the moment was surreal. They had begged for answers, prayed for justice, but nothing could prepare them for the details of what had happened. Her mother, upon hearing the confession, said only, "I finally know," but it doesn't bring her back. The man was booked into jail, awaiting trial. For the first time in over a decade, the case that had haunted an entire town had a name, a face, and a confession. Justice, long delayed, was now within reach. The courthouse was packed. On the first day of trial, the hallway outside the courtroom echoed with hushed voices, reporters adjusting their cameras, and the shuffle of jurors filing in. For more than a decade, this case had been an open wound. Now at last, the town would hear the truth in the solemn arena of justice. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out a meticulous narrative, guiding the jury through years of pain and persistence. They presented the DNA, the genealogy links, the witness testimonies, and most damning of all, the suspect's own confession. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, forming a picture too solid to dismiss. The family sat quietly in the front row, their faces pale but determined. For the first time, they heard every detail laid bare. Each word was like a dagger, yet they held on. They had waited too long to turn away now. The defense, in contrast, appeared fragile. Their strategy leaned on technicalities, on questioning lab procedures, on suggesting that the confession was coerced. But the jury could see what the town already knew. The evidence was overwhelming. The suspect himself sat impassive at the table, eyes vacant, lips pressed into a thin line. If he felt remorse, he did not show it. Witness after witness stepped forward. The lead detective described the sleepless nights, the years spent staring at photographs pinned to a board. Forensic experts explained how science had caught up with the past, and the family spoke. Her mother recounting the agony of birthdays missed, the constant fear of never knowing. The courtroom grew silent, heavy with grief. As her words filled the air,
The prosecution's closing argument was devastating in its clarity. For 12 years, the attorney said, his voice firm, this community has waited for justice. Science has spoken. The truth has been confessed. The time has come. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the atmosphere was electric, hearts pounding in anticipation. The foreman stood, voice steady, and delivered the words the family had longed to hear, guilty. A wave of emotion swept through the room. Some cried openly, others bowed their heads in silence. The suspect showed no reaction, staring blankly ahead, as though the verdict belonged to someone else. Sentencing followed quickly. The judge's words carried the weight of the community's suffering. He condemned the cruelty of the act, the years of silence, the shattered lives left behind. The sentence, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. It was justice, at least in the eyes of the law, but for the family, it was only partial closure. No verdict, no sentence, could ever bring her back. The empty chair at their table would always remain, yet they walked out of that courtroom with something they had been denied for so long, answers. Justice had finally arrived, but it came wrapped in sorrow. The verdict had been read, the sentence handed down, but when the gavel struck for the final time, the silence that followed was deafening. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, broadcasting the end of a story that had haunted a community for more than a decade. Yet for the family, the true ending felt far more complicated. In interviews afterward, her mother spoke softly, her voice carrying both relief and exhaustion. "We finally have justice," she said, "but justice doesn't heal, it doesn't bring her back." Her words captured the paradox of closure, answers delivered, but hearts still broken. The town, too, struggled to absorb the truth. For years they had whispered theories, clung to rumors, built myths to explain the unexplainable. Now the myth was gone, replaced by something far darker, the realization that evil had been living among them all along. Neighbors who had once greeted the suspect at the grocery store, waved to him in passing, now recoiled at the thought. Trust, once easy in this small Michigan town, had been fractured beyond repair. Candlelit vigils turned into memorials of remembrance, not desperation. The posters were gone, replaced by plaques, flowers, and framed photographs. Her name was no longer followed by the word missing, it was followed by the word remembered. The detectives who had worked the case for years reflected on the journey. One admitted, "There were times I thought we'd never get here, but science caught up, and persistence mattered." Their obsession, once a burden, was now vindicated. They had brought the truth into the light, even if it came too late to save her. The trial and its outcome became a broader lesson. In community centers and classrooms, people spoke about the importance of not giving up on cold cases. Forensic science, once limited, was now seen as a beacon of hope for countless families still waiting for answers. Yet despite justice, an emptiness remained. Each year, the family still set a place at the table, still spoke her name aloud, still felt her absence like a shadow in every celebration. Grief, they learned, was not something to be erased by verdicts or prison walls. It was something carried, day after day, with the weight of love that never had a chance to fade. As the years moved forward, the town rebuilt itself, scarred but resilient. The case became a chapter in its history, told and retold, a reminder of both its darkest night and its hardest-earned dawn. For the family, healing was slow, uneven, but steady. They honored her not through tears alone, but through remembering her laughter, her kindness, her future that had once been so bright. The narrator's voice closes with haunting finality. For 12 years the truth was buried, but in the end, silence could not last forever. Justice found its voice, and though the scars remain, so too does the memory of a life that mattered.